welcome to today's session where we continue to discuss the short story by William Faulkner, A Rose for Emily. As we had started looking at in the previous session, this is a story in which where Faulkner has exemplified the life of this woman, Emily, in the context of the American South. We also briefly recall that Faulkner has usually been trying to portray the life of the American South, and the context of this short story is also in the aftermath of the Civil War, after the abolition of slavery, a period during which an economic and social reconstruction is happening in America. We were also trying to take a closer look at the short story. Towards the end of the second section, we realized that Emily, according to the narrator, is beginning to show certain signs of very peculiar behavior, rather abnormal kind of behavior, when she holds on to her father's dead body and refuses to admit that he is dead. And she had to be forced and coerced into giving up the dead body after 3 days. So this also gives us a sense that Emily is a character who is forever in denial. Her idea of history, her idea of society, her value system, her idea of her own life, it's frozen in time. She is completely oblivious to the changes which happen in terms of seasons, in terms of generations, in terms of the changing order of systems, in terms of the societal norms or the governmental norms. She's completely oblivious to those things. We find that getting displayed in minor as well as major ways in this short story. There are five sections altogether in this story, and many critics have pointed out that this also is a perfectly written story in that sense. There is a kind of a formatic perfection which has been attributed to this story, and the way it has been divided into 5 neat sections. And there is a sense of chronology which is distributed across this narration. Several critics and readers tried to give a sense of, at least a tentative sense of the dates and to reveal the exact nature of the chronology which this story projects. Except for one date that this story mentions, which is 1894. This appears in the first section of the story when we are being made privy to this information that it was in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, remitted her taxes, the dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. So except for this date, we only have certain other kinds of indicators of time. For instance, the section 3, the third section of this story, it begins by saying she was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl with a vague resemblance to those angels in colored church windows, sort of tragic and serene. There are different indicators of time that we get. There are different descriptions of Emily given at various points of time, which also will give us the understanding that Emily is also aging and that Emily is changing in different ways physically. But what comes across as interesting through these changes which are manifested physically is that she continues to remain perhaps pretty much the same mentally. We do not find her attitudes changing, at least that is a notion that we get when we are introduced to this story through this narrator. We do not get any sense of Emily responding or reacting to the changes. She remains quite constant almost throughout, holding on to the things that are dear to her and in a state of denial, in a state which forces her to remain frozen in time, refusing to accept the new changes, the new order which is coming into being at the governmental level, at the societal level, and also in the many ways that she sees locally around her. In the third section, we are also introduced to the other important character, Homer Barron. This is how the story introduces her. A foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big dark ready man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the riggers, and the riggers singing in time to rise and fall of picks. Pretty soon, he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently, we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons, driving in the yellow-wheeled buggy and the match team of bays from the livery stable. So Homer Barron becomes important for this narration because of his association with Emily. He is a northerner, a Yankee, and he is entirely different from the conservative South. He comes across as someone who represents whatever Emily is not. He is presented as a very lively character, very much liked by everyone in the locality, and his presence is visible and audible, unlike that of Emily's. And we find that Emily and Homer Barron are together for some time, and the town begins to gossip about how a typical South white woman like Emily will fit in with this this alliance with a northerner like Homer Barron. When we are presented with Homer Barron, the typical expectation is that a love story will follow. But unlike our expectations, challenging the reader's expectations, Faulkner takes us on a different ride altogether. Homer Barron is a northerner, and he is also, we come to know as the story progresses, he's a homosexual. Perhaps his interest is more in men, and that also makes him an unsuitable husband for Emily. The story does not say that in too many ways. It is something that we infer in the process of the reading. And the introduction of Homer Barron and the presentation of the relation between Emily and Homer, it can be seen as a reaction against the previous age's sentimentality. The way Faulkner presents this story, it's very evident that he does not want to present a typical North-South love story. He does not want to follow with the typical tradition where the South woman falls in love with the North man, and then they come together amicably, resolving all the differences between them. Here, it's a very stark reaction. It's a counter response against the prevalent sentimentality and the prevalent expectations. As much as the town is excited about this new relation, they begin to gossip about it between Emily and Homer. They also realize that it's not perhaps leading towards a marriage. We do find a series of things happening in between. We find Homer going away, we find Emily's relatives coming to stay with her, and there are all kinds of speculations that the town indulges in, and the town is always following and paying attention to what Emily is doing. And this is the point of view through which Emily is presented to us. We find the entire town almost stalking Emily, paying attention to what she does and stalking almost every move of hers. It is in that sense that the town begins to talk about why Emily wanted to buy rat poison. Let me take you back to the beginning of the story, where we understand that the narrator is an unreliable narrator who also uses the pronoun we. It's a collective opinion of the town that this narrator is trying to express. So we get to know that the entire town is interested in gossiping about whatever Emily is doing. And here, when we are introduced to this episode, to this segment, where she goes to buy rat poison, she buys arsenic, and the pharmacist, the druggist, is also equally apprehensive about selling it to her. But nevertheless, because of the prestige and the privilege that she enjoys in the South, she manages to get it without even really convincing the druggist. And people begin to assume in the fourth section that she's about to commit suicide. So that's the extent to which they talk about Emily, or they think it is okay to make judgments or to make any kind of prophetic comments about Emily's life and the decisions that she would be taking. It's also a typical Southern trait where the conservative attitude also leads them to believe that they do have the legitimate permission to talk about women, especially single women, in a way which is not really becoming. And in section 4, we are also given a few more details about the various phases that Emily goes through. It tells us about the last time when the town saw Homer Barron, and for almost 6 months how Emily did not appear on the streets, and the next time when the town saw Emily, she had grown fat, and many details like that. And we are also given another concrete detail in section 4, just like the year 1894 in the first section. After the day of her death at 74, we get to know that she was 74 when she died. At the time of this narration, right after Emily Grierson's death, we know that we are being introduced to a story which spans over 7 decades, a little more than 7 decades. In the fourth section, after giving us a few more details about the frequent appearances that Emily made during this period of time, we are led to an abrupt end. The last segment in section 4, she died in one of the downstairs rooms in a heavy walnut bed with a curtain, her grey head propped on a pillow yellow and mouldy with age and lack of sunlight. This description also tells us about the decay and the aging that both Emily and the house had undergone, and by extension it also refers to that tradition that Emily and her house represented, how they had become very old, how they had become outdated, and how they had become yellow and moldy with age and lack of sunlight. Before going to the final segment of this story, it will be useful to briefly talk about the importance of the exact chronology in this story. As pointed out, many researchers and critics, they have tried to recreate the chronology, trying to find out when exactly what happened. Like most other works of Faulkner's, here also he has left us a lot of clues. He has left a lot of clues for the readers to recreate the chronology, to fit the puzzle. And there are also a few things that he would deliberately leave as a gap. John L. Skinner, in one of his essays on A Rose for Emily, he points out the exact chronology is actually of little interest or relevance and may indeed be irrecoverable. Any small discrepancies in the text are quite compatible with the character of the narrator. In spite of this, we also make a brief attempt to recreate the chronology. These are tentative dates. There could be a difference of 2 to 3 years in this. This is a recreation based on the single date that we get at the outset of the story, 1894, the year when the mayor decides to exempt the Griersons from the taxes. So roughly it can be considered that Miss Emily Grierson was born in 1861. The range could be up to 1864. It's safe to assume that she was born somewhere between 1861 and 1864. And by 1893, and in this way we continue to create, it's when Emily's father dies, and it's in 94 that Emily meets Homer Barron. It's notable here to mention that Emily meeting Homer Barron after the death of her father is very important, because when her father was still alive, he had not approved of a number of suitors who would not fit in with the family tradition or the aristocratic setting. And in 1895, that's when Homer is last seen entering Miss Emily's house, and around this time Emily is also over 30. 1895 is when the incident related with the smell occurs. And in 1895, we also know that Miss Emily stays in for 6 months. Between 95 and 98, Emily emerges. She's more visible to the town, and people notice that her hair begins to gradually turn grey. By 1909, again, she does not leave the house for about 5 years. By 1904, she's again visible for about 7 years, giving china painting lessons. By 1911, she stops giving these lessons, and then again she spends almost a decade, almost 10 years without maintaining any contact with the town. Please bear in mind that these are not exact dates, these are mostly tentative. It can be a couple of years more or less. By 1925, this is when the newer generation begins to inquire about the Griersons. They begin to talk about the taxes. They are more aware of the changing economic order. They also want to incorporate the Griersons, Emily's family, into the tax-paying category. And this happens almost 30 years after the smell. And the smell, the incident of the episode of the smell, where people complain even to the judge about the smell which is coming out from her backyard, that had happened shortly after her father's death. And this incident, which happens in 1925, where the newer generation go to ask her about the taxes, that is perhaps the last contact that she has with the town. And of course, we also know that she is oblivious to the changing times and the changing rules, and she refuses to accept this request or even interact politely with them. By 1935, at the age of 74, we find that Emily Grierson dies. Toby, her manservant, the Negro, that's how he is described, he leaves the house. And Toby is also one interesting character. He does not maintain any contact with the town either. He can be seen as an extension of Emily. We do not get to know anything about Toby except for the fact that he goes out once in a while to the market, and people find it extremely difficult to extract any secret or any information from him. He remains as this trusted black servant in the Grierson's house until the moment Miss Emily dies. And this is one concrete way in which we find the story and Emily's house preserving the southern tradition, preserving the hierarchy of race, a hierarchy of class, till the moment of Emily's death. And towards the end, we also realize that the funeral is about to happen 2 days later, and then the climax happens when the narrator takes us to that room upstairs, which no one has seen in the last 40 years. And what happens in that room and the sight that they see and the resulting interpretation, that's a resolution of the story, and that one incident gives a lot of meaning to this entire series of episodes that we were introduced to. In the final section, this is the passage which talks about that room. Already we knew that there was one room in that region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. And even at the time of her death, we realized that the town does not continue their interest in her. They had always been gossiping about her, and even at the time of her death, their interest is in unearthing more secrets about Miss Emily. This also perfectly justifies the use of the title, A Rose for Emily. This is going to be that moment, the climax is going to be that moment when the confidentiality, the secrecy with which Emily led her life, it's going to be torn apart. The veil is going to be removed. And it also tells us about this continuing invasion in the conservative South into private affairs even after the order had changed. There are multiple ways in which we find change occurring in this short story, in the form of the new generation asking for taxes, in the form of people seeing the decay and the aging of a tradition of this aristocratic household. But what remains pretty much unchanged is the town's attitude towards this woman who was at one point privileged and who also was under the eye of their surveillance, mostly on account of her single status. So what the town people see when they open this door, that may give the story away, so we will not be going to that section. So that final segment brings in a certain kind of a closure, but at the same time it does not really resolve anything, and that's a point I think Faulkner also wanted to leave behind. This story is not about finding a solution, it's not about resolving any kind of conflict, it's not about coming together of different segments of people, and it is certainly not about erasing the differences. What the climax does to this story is only to add more flavor to Emily's character. It only helps us to tie certain loose ends and to see how and why the smell had come in the first place, and why this room was not being made open for the others, and why occasionally perhaps Emily refused to come out of the house or entertain guests or interact with others. There is a tying up of loose ends that happen. Other than that, the intention is not to provide any kind of a resolution at the end. Coming back to again look at some of the important themes in this story, it's about isolation. We find Emily being isolated, and she is presented in a counter way vis-a-vis the town. We find the entire community gossiping and almost conspiring against this woman Emily. So the kind of isolation that she feels can be looked at from different angles. It is gender specific, it is class specific, and it was also about the kind of individual that Emily is. There are certain things about Emily which completely cannot be understood within the framework of gender and within the framework of class alone. There is also another kind of her personality, which is perhaps a continuation of her of the dominating nature of her father, or perhaps the inability in her to find suitable friends. The only kind of relationship that she sustains throughout is this master-servant relation that she has with the Negro Toby. So other than that, we find her completely isolated, and what isolation does to this woman is being explored very effectively in the course of the story. And even while Emily remains isolated, the collectiveness with which the town pursues her in a way that they almost stalks her without her knowing about it, that also comes across as an interesting thing. The story also effectively uses the element of memory. The story is in the form of a kind of a recollection. We have a narrator who's not a reliable narrator, it's an unreliable narrator, but the way Faulkner makes use of this narrator, he is cleverly manipulating this narrator to remember things in a particular order so that the narration will have a certain element of suspense. It will also have a racy effect to it, and it also ensures that it never loses the attention of the readers. And even when the story begins, after having read through the entire story, we understand that the narrator already knows certain details. He already knows the secret, he already knows what the rose is, but he chooses to reveal that only towards the end of the story. And when we look at this from the point of view of the author, Faulkner, we know that the story is written long after Emily's death. So this is a recreation of not just Emily's past, but it's also a recreation of the past of America's South. It's a recreation of how things were before a few decades, during the time of Reconstruction, during the time when the society was undergoing a lot of change after the Civil War. So memory plays a significant role here. So there are also a number of critics who have looked at this story from the aspects of gender, from the aspects of race. But what becomes interesting is that the racist tone which this story at times conveys, the male gaze which becomes evident in this story, they all become quite normalized when it is looked through the lens of memory. So it's impossible to pronounce a value judgment over either the narrator or the character of Emily. As pointed out earlier, there is a sympathetic tone which is built into this story, even when it is presented in a detached way, even when it is presented in a matter-of-fact historical sense. We also get a sense of the past of various characters. If you look at this story, it's not just about the past of Emily, it is also about the past and the present that the community collectively is inhabiting. And if we can take the narrator as the spokesperson of this community, of this town, we know that the narrator is in a certain way reliving his own past, thinking about how they used to look at the Griersons then maybe 40-50 years back, and how they look at the Griersons today, and how that day when the funeral is held, it is a resolution for these the town people as well, for the narrator as well, because they all had been waiting to know what was there in that room, which was locked for about 4 decades. They all had been waiting to get some kind of an admission into the Griersons' house, because they could only see Emily from a distance. They could only see this house from a distance. They were never made privy to the private affairs of neither Emily nor this household. So this journey through the past becomes a historical journey and a personal journey at almost the same time. And finally, we are also given different versions of reality. The reality which the narrator encounters, the reality from the community's point of view, and the reality which Emily is constantly in denial of. And these various versions sit together quite comfortably in this narration, and that is perhaps the master craftsmanship that Faulkner also displays. As we wrap up this lecture, I leave you with this observation by Lionel Trilling. Rose for Emily, the story of a woman who has killed her lover and is lain for years beside his decaying corpse, is essentially trivial in its horror because it has no implications, because it's pure event without implication. This is an observation which has been oft quoted whenever Rose for Emily is discussed. This is a story which is described as pure event because there is no implication. This story has love, there is murder, there is history, there is even necrophilia as we come to the end of the story. But what makes the story beautiful is this aspect of pure event which has no implication. And to be able to narrate a story which has no implication, to be able to put in succession a series of events without any implication, that perhaps is the power and craft of a storyteller like Faulkner. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.